Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to tonight's 49 Writers Cross Currents keynote event, organized to kick off the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read program here in Juneau. I'm Jeremy Pataki. I'm the executive director of 49 Writers. It's awesome to be back in Juneau, where it's always sunny. 49 Writers works across the state to engage, empower, and inspire a statewide community of Alaskan writers and readers. We do that with our core values of creativity, craft, and culture guiding us. And it's a big honor to partner again with Juneau Public Libraries in this work. Because books are not just for reading, our Cross Currents events like tonight's unite authors and audiences through live discussions on questions pertaining to art, culture, and science as illuminated by writers and their work. Tonight's event features authors Ishmael Hope Don Rearden in an onstage conversation moderated by writer Karina Cook, and will bridge themes from their own writing and experience and those in this year's Big Read text, In the Heart of the Sea. On behalf of the 49 Writers Board of Directors and myself and staff, we thank our partners behind tonight's event, namely Juneau Public Libraries, especially Kate Inge, the Alaska State Libraries, Archives, and Museum, thank you, Claire, and the friends groups working to support both of these institutions. Thanks to Ishmael, Karina, and Don. More info about 49 Writers classes, events, and projects is available online at 49writers.org. Check it out often, check back, and sign up there or out at the table afterwards to receive our newsletters to stay tuned about more programming here in Juneau and elsewhere in the state and online. Finally, it's my great pleasure to welcome our esteemed moderator, Karina Cook, who recently returned to North Douglas after a Fulbright year in Whitehorse, Yukon. She earned a PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Missouri and writes about northern sorrows and friendships. And I'll leave it to her to introduce our friends Ishmael and Don. Thank you for attending tonight, and please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks also to Kate, and thanks to the museum. Thanks to all y'all for being here as well. My name is Karina Cook. So here's what to expect for the hour. I will introduce our speakers, Ishmael Hope and Don Rearden. They will read for you super brief excerpts of their own work. Then we will turn to our Big Read book by Nathaniel Philbrick here, about which Ishmael and Don will say surprising and thoughtful things that will spark for you many insights. And then at about 6:45, we'll turn it over to you for questions. So keep track of those insights, right? And then at 7, we'll cross the finish line. Everyone can high five everyone else, and we will reconvene out those doors in the atrium where Ishmael and Don will be available to sign copies of their books for you. All right, introductions. To my right, Ishmael Hope is a poet, playwright, and storyteller who lives in Juneau, Alaska, with his wife, Weaver Lily Hope, and their 5 children. His most recent book of poetry was Rock Piles Along the Eddy. That's with Ishmael Reed Publications. And he has recently had his poetry included in publications such as Poetry Magazine and Native Voices, Indigenous American Poetry, Craft, and Conversations. Don Rearden, to my left, spent most of his childhood on the tundra of southwestern Alaska. A professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He's the author of the 2013 Washington Post notable novel, The Raven's Gift. He's a screenwriter and has co-authored the memoirs Warrior's Creed and Never Quit. He lives in an undisclosed location somewhere on a mountain outside of Anchorage. So welcome these two, please. All right, let's go straight to the readings. Give us a few minutes of your work. We'll start with Don here.
Okay, thanks for having me down to Juneau. It is always sunny here when I come. I swear, I love it. Love this place, and I'm really glad to be back and honored to be on stage with these two. And it's great to finally get to meet Ishmael as well. So I'm honored to share this time with him. So
Sheesh.
thank you.
Rihanna.
So I'm going to share two very brief poems. They'll both give you a little bit of perspective, kind of where I'm coming from probably in this discussion. This first one was inspired by a photo that I found in the Alaska Digital Archives that just had a picture of these three dudes standing in front of a creature. That's all I'm going to give on it. It's called Unbridled Progress. Stand in shine shoes, derby hats, in black unbridled progress. Ties and scarves wrapped tight around your throat as the noose on the moose, and your reins on this land, the creatures and her people. And then this next one would be kind of my transition to the discussion of the heart of the sea and this notion of whales and maybe seeing from a different perspective, which I hope I always get to add to any discussion. This is 200 years. I have swam beneath the ice for 200 winters, watched 200 summer suns shine upon this turbulent sea, saw your kin upon the shore stepping gently, leaving only footprints first, then wooden paddle strokes, soon rumbles and streaks in the sky. I have seen your rise rapid as the moonlight spread across a tundra plain, and now watch while the moonset makes ready, remembering how 200 years you watched for my spout, saw hope in the mist, made my grandmother into corsets, carved my mother for a mangled meal, for the bottom crawlers, with war weapons, steel whales with your men sealed, screaming inside. Some of your kind believe we wield the ability to hear those thoughts in your head, your actions, are already gale force. Only if you listened long enough at the ocean's edge, everything would crystallize, clear, and 200 years you would bear witness from sea. Thanks. It is okay after to clap after poetry. Always remind people of that. Thanks.
Right on. All right, Rihanna, Sheesh. That's some good stuff. I went to high school around the same time with Karina, and I've been wanting to get to know, Dawn for years. So I'm just really pleased here. So I want to touch a little bit on some kind of maritime culture, and so I will go to. Let's see. I had it. Here. Midnight Forest. Oh, well, this is... No. Never mind. Here, the reason why I had an idea of something that would be a little political, a little more hardcore, and I'm just hoping not to turn you guys off. So that's all I'll say. Step toward dismantling collective psychosis on colonized land. This is native land. Until you recognize this, there is no justice. Until you act on this, there is no justice. Until you dig deeper than empathy, there is no justice. Until you give where you never should have taken in the first place, there is no justice. Taking up the space, the land, the airtime, the mic, the profits, the recognition, the dialogue, the conversation, it'll never feel right. This Utah-sized village of skeleton people will always haunt you. The shadow slithering from the earth's fire pit will always follow you. You can't logic it away because this is insanely illogical. You can't normalize it because our ancestors' bones among the cigarette butts are snapping at your ankles. Our tears are staining your leather couches and organdy dresses. Our children who are multiplying like leaves are chewing on your knee tendons, smearing cowgut on your pant legs. At this moment, we're setting booby traps in your electric boxes, dropping pungent octopus bait on your roof gutters, sucking the grease from each other's mind, armoring ourselves for the calamity that is always here, our burden since before we were born. At this moment, we are conjuring the heart warmth of all those who died by your guns and redundant viruses. At this moment, we are purifying ourselves in the waterfalls that you haven't yet mapped. At this moment, we are conducting ceremonies from pieces that grow like spiders' torn limbs, like raven's tail robes, rewoven from scraps dug up in river delta. At this moment, we are bringing groceries to our grandmothers, getting advice on how to remake the world when the settler state collapses. And our grandmothers knit wool sock for us, and our grandmothers feed us rice, seaweed, and smoked salmon. And our grandmothers teach us to speak up at the next insane panel. And our grandmothers remind us who we are, shield us in copper alloy. And if you want to learn how to undo this terror, begin by earning our grandmother's respect. Thank you. I read this to a group of high schoolers one time, and they were really freaked out that I wanted to hurt them or something. It's like, you guys, I've been with you this whole time. Please think about it a moment. Anyway.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. I know that there are audience members who have probably read Nathaniel Philbrick's book, but there are probably some who also haven't. So I want to offer a book summary, and then I'd like to ask our speakers to reflect on the very widespread appeal of survival stories. So here's the book in a nutshell. You still need to read it, right? The nutshell isn't fair, but here's the book in the nutshell. Nathaniel Philbrick's book is a long-form narrative nonfiction history of a Nantucket whaling ship called the Essex. A sperm whale attacks the ship, which sank, and this is 1820, by which time sperm whales have been suffering greatly from commercialized whaling and that industry. So a whale attacks the Essex. Herman Melville, of course, writes Moby Dick, largely in dialogue with this history. And having been attacked by a whale, the Essex sinks in the South Pacific. We then have a 20-person crew. Actually, I can say men, the 20-man crew. This is not a sex and gender inclusive industry here. So the 20-man crew piles into 3 whale boats, at which time they are thousands of miles away from the coast of South America. 3 months of navigation and starvation and so on ensue. Ultimately, 8 men survive. They survive in part by cannibalizing 7 of their other crew members. So in fact, this book opens with an image of 2 crazed and ravenous men, each at opposite ends of a whaleboat filled with human skeletons. And each of the crazed and ravenous men in this scene cling to various of their shipmates' bones, initially refusing upon rescue to give up what they're gnawing on. So I want to ask our speakers to tackle the question of this story's appeal. It's very widespread appeal, even. So Don, let's start with you, and then we'll hear from Ishmael. Can you speak to the appeal really of this kind of history and of others like it? What compels artists to engage with survival stories? What compels readers, in the case of textual arts, to read them?
That's a really good question. I think the appeal of survival stories works on many different levels for us. I think artists initially maybe write them because people will read them. People like them because what they do is they force us to sort of suspend our own reality and how we live and imagine living in the moment. A survival story makes you imagine and kind of get to go along with people who are only, like, their only concern is to make it today, where our contemporary world, like, we're sort of putting off living. I'm gonna go see that sunset when I can do it later after I work some more. And I think that's part of our appeal to it. It's that we have a chance to escape and really escape into a situation where every moment counts. And so I think that's a little bit of it. I think that's the appeal of the survival story on really simple, on a simple kind of human fundamental level.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of survival stories in particularly my northern heritage on both Inupiaq and Tlingit, and there's survival in Tlingit and very, very rich maritime cultures, indigenous cultures. I think we're going to blow apart soon the whole land bridge theory. I think there was a maritime culture, really, really rich maritime culture on the Pacific Rim, where a lot of interchange and trade and migration happened, over many thousands of years. And I think that's a very fascinating tack in this book. I was actually in the play Moby Dick back when I was 19 and 20, and that at Perseverance Theater, and then we toured the state, so with my name being Ishmael, that's that was unending joy and fun for people, and it was it was an avant-garde play, that was had a lot of New York avant-garde stuff, and then Inuit, history, and whaling captains from Barrow were interviewed and included in the play, and it was a wild and crazy, thing. So I think from this tack, there's an interesting parallel between that survival stuff that Don's talking about and just the American West and the idea of frontier and extracting wealth, and something really amazing and also very weird and strange about, getting that condensed energy, that will create wealth because it's condensed, it's oil, it's literal condensed energy that'll create wealth from these big whales that risk a life and have a high mortality rate in order to get them. So I think there's a very fascinating maritime culture going on throughout the book. That's so I'm finding myself very interested in just how many ounces of hardtack are they going to have for this part of the thing, So there's that's interesting to me, just in terms of how to get by in this crazy environment with also that underlying thrust to extract that wealth, and at that point where oil, plant-based oil, hadn't been tapped.
It's interesting what you're saying too, is thinking about survival. Survival's always about not having resources. Whatever resources you have, once those get stripped away, then that becomes the survival story. And so people who have gone through, I know in the room, I know there's some people who have gone through their own personal kind of survival stories. You're stripped down to the essence of humanity. And then our kind of Western culture is so fascinated with these. It's always explorers and those people and their survival stories, and then they're having this hard time surviving. And then there's the indigenous people that are just living okay, right? Like they're like, you can eat that, you won't get scurvy.
But I will note that there are some really good stories of surviving hunger and surviving being abandoned that are just throughout the Northwest Coast and all along really the Alaskan coast, Yupik, Inupiaq, and all those, and also in the interior, Athabascan and the rest of the tribes. But there's definitely a different take on how that is done. There's the concept of Western culture, Western literature, just Western psychological orientation that is about man versus, and when I talked with Karina earlier about this, she rightly noted the gendered use of that language: man versus man versus nature, man, versus God. And if we have an opportunity, just in the short time we have, to talk a little bit about how indigenous cultures maybe have a sense of ecological relationships. That's not such this contention that you see played out throughout this book. I mean, I particularly all the maritime details and ship logs and how they repair the boats and all that kind of stuff. I'm absolutely fascinated by. But I think a thing to have some critical thinking on is that relationship of the agon man versus and then to consider other ways of being and knowing particularly from my vantage point indigenous. That's more of an ecological relationship.
I'm going to piggyback straight onto the direction that you're going here. Philbrick's book really, it is very much about human survival. It's not so much about the grief that sperm whales suffer at the hands of an out-of-control commercial whaling industry. But the book frames human survival exactly as you're saying, adversarially. So the whale is a monster or a beast, and then after that, perhaps the Pacific Ocean itself is a monster, a beast. Either way, this is a book about people fighting, perhaps, as you're saying, men in particular. It's about fighting against. So I want to talk about how stories reflect fundamental relationships. So Philbrick's story reflects a fundamental relationship of adversity, but Ishmael has offered to speak about stories that reflect some very different relationships between humans and animals, maybe specifically whales, or more widely between humans and the more than human world. And Don, you've said a little bit about a project you're working on in which you're constructing a whale's point of view. I think we got a taste of that from your reading also. So in contrast to Philbrick's story of adversity, talk to us about stories that construct a dramatically different mode of thinking and relating. Ishmael, first on this one?
Sure. I think it helps to try to really, we're talking generalities, but try to really get, sink our teeth into what we're talking about here. And to me, it's the mythology of the American West. And I am very fascinated by Western films and books like this. And it just makes me, I feel like an anthropologist because I'm, even though I grew up in, around, non-natives, I'm native, so, but I consider I think a good parallel is of resource extraction is clearly, plant-based oil and extracting it from the ground. And I think reading alongside this book, I got to thinking about the movie There Will Be Blood, and the bloodlust for getting that oil. And that's throughout that movie, and so brilliantly played by what's his name, Daniel Day-Lewis. And there's this one scene in there where someone is pretending to be his brother, and wants to get in on that oil money. And eventually he finds out that it's all a scam, and the Daniel Day-Lewis character kills him. But what's really brilliant about that scene, Paul Thomas Anderson exploring the American West and that whole drive to create that wealth, dehumanizes the people who are doing that. And that scene in particular stood out to me in how haunting it is when there's someone who thought they had one brother, one family member, one person they could connect with in their whole life, and they don't have that brother all of a sudden, and then they kill that brother. And then the moment after that scene of just, it's theatrical, it's like a proscenium shot. It's like a theater shot. I think it's an amazing scene, and haunting scene, and jarring scene. And I think there's a lot of Western films like that, and I wouldn't, I wouldn't be really cool talking to a bunch of hardcore, natives about this, but I like watching John Wayne movies, and it even with knowing the issues it presents, there's something fascinating in how the extent to which the human psyche needs to go to dehumanize the other in order to get to the point of actually killing them so you could get your wealth. And how in The Searchers it does that with the Native Americans. The famous John Ford movie, it does that with Native Americans. So I want to just point out that briefly in the minute that we have, and then go back to indigenous, which is Anne Feinup Rearden. She's an amazing Yupik anthropologist of the Yupik peoples, who is mainly now featured elders and the voices of the elders. Something that she's pointed out is the losing of the walrus population is not from just over harvesting. That elders point out it's because we don't have the respect for those walruses. That's why they don't come back. If we have a respectful relationship with those walruses, that's how they return again and again and again, almost like reincarnation. That's the worldview and how everything is set up. And that's just one small, the tiniest of the tip of the tiniest iceberg reflection of that type of native worldview, that respectful, reciprocal relationship. I grew up with my mother telling me when a hunter goes out, they're not going to say what they're going out to do. They're not going to say, I'm going out to hunt. I'm going to try to get the biggest thing I could get. They don't say that. They say, I think I'm going to go out for a little bit. They don't even tell what they're going for because they don't want to scare off that animal. They clean their tools very carefully. They clean out the pathway that they're going to go out. And they think good thoughts about what they're going to catch. And they imagine the sea. They're always thinking of that sea, it's a sea mammal. They're imagining themselves being out there and encountering certain things as they go along, and the weather and the challenges and of course the animal. And then that animal gives itself to you. If you are a hunter who is respectful and appreciates and does all the right things and has the clarity of mind towards that animal will pick you. Paul John, one of the great Yupik elders, storytellers, really, really illustrates this in his story, The Boy Who Lived Among the Seals, where there's the seal leader who's telling the boy as he's living among the seals, oh, you see that hunter? That hunter has a bucket on his head. And you know why? Because he's never thinking about the sea. He can't see anything in front of him. Oh, that hunter, he's floating above the water. You know why? Because that hunter's not thinking about being on the water. That hunter has like hair hanging from his mouth because he does something funny with the bucket when he drinks the water. So those kind of things of proper, good, respectful behavior that leads to that relationship of the eternal return is what Richard Downhauer would call it. These animals who keep coming back from that relationship. It's a sustainable, and it proves to be, a sustainable, long-term type relationship.
Thank you. Don, I'm really interested to hear about the research that you've been immersed in and the way in which you're thinking to construct a whale as a character and work with point of view.
Yeah, it's been, I guess, a project I've been working on for 8 years now, 8 or 9 years. And the initial impetus was just thinking about a one bowhead whale and how it could live. A glimpse of it was kind of in the poem that, like now we're saying upwards of 200 years, one could live as long or longer than that. So then what would one in Alaska see? And that's kind of been the direction I've been going and thinking about that idea of if a whale could know what we're thinking, and even vice versa, that exchange. And then, but then also being deeply interested in the commercial whaling aspect of it. So I had the good fortune to be a scholar in residence at the New Bedford Whaling Museum for a week, and that was really crazy. I got to just read whaling journals for a week and immerse myself in that world, and go to Nantucket, walk the streets of Nantucket, go walk in the water off the shore. Like, I just wanted to do things like that to feel it. And then at Mystic Seaport, they have constructed a little whaling village, and they were the Charles Morgan is a whaling ship that they were I think it might be in the water by now, but it wasn't then. But I got to walk on board it and kind of lay down on the beds and the bunks, and just kind of that was part of the immersive experience of it too. But a lot of it has been thinking just about whaling from the aspect of just this whale and what it's seen in Alaska with the maritime culture, from the Inupiaq hunters to who first were hunting them, to the things that they would see. You know, like, Alaska has such a crazy history, and one whale in the span of 200 years, like, what that whale has seen just boggles my mind. If you're just thinking only what it could see and feel in the water. So they would hear the commercial whaling, they would hear the deaths of all these other whales around the planet, because we know now that whales can, you know, like, they're hearing stuff that's happening all over the planet from underwater, which is amazing to me. And so they would be hearing the death of all these whales, and then the whaling fleet's moving towards them because they're clearing out the oceans of the sperm whales, and then they discover this garden of whales in the Arctic, the polar whale they were calling it, which were the bowheads, and then moving up into the north. And so that idea I'm fascinated with, but then also just the other elements of what this one whale could see, you know, like the sinking of the Shenandoah, the ship that was sinking the whaling ships in the Arctic. That's fascinating to me. The last shots of the Civil War essentially were in Alaska. And so a whale could see that. And then you move forward fast forward, and you've got I captured a little snippet of it in the poem, but the idea of the World War II and those vicious battles, you know, against the Japanese. And so the whales hearing and feeling that impact, and then on to the nuclear detonations at Amchitka and those sort of crazy military experiments we've done in Alaska. And then fast forward to oil exploration and all of that. So I'm fascinated with that idea. And so it's really that from the whale's perspective. And I think, you know, there's elements of this book that I really like, all the stuff about maritime culture and all the history that's been captured in it. But it really is from that Western perspective. And I mean, he's capturing that. But the idea of the things that I think are kind of funny, I always like to add a joke or two in here. When the whale, spoiler alert, when the whale sinks the boat. I didn't mean to ruin it for you. There's these lines that are repeated in it, and it's as if it's watching them. Starts out, it's as if it's watching them. Like, really, like, it's sitting out there away from the boat, as if it's not watching them. Really, like, those of you that know, you're from Alaska, you know animals. They know more than we give them credit for. As if, and then after it hits them, it comes back, and it's like, another line is as if, again, there's these repetitions, as if distracted with rage. You know, really. They're over there killing your family, and you're this monstrous whale. It's as if they could do that. You know, like, that's really I think the mindset that it's where we get it wrong. It's as if they don't know this stuff. Like, they knew, yeah.
Thank you. I think we're going to try to grab one more question in this format, and then we will turn it over to all of you. I want to point out another, perhaps a small gap in this text, and an issue of its perspective. The Essex crew members included some white people and some black people. everyone is starving, right? Everyone. But notably, Black crew members die first, and notably the first ones to be cannibalized are also Black. The text is explicit about these racialized divisions, but really only a few passages touch on the really insidious role of white supremacy. So I want to invite our speakers to comment further. Just talk us through some of your thinking around either the intersection of survival and race or extraction and race.
Let me go first. Just kidding. I will defer to you, Ishmael. Thank you.
I'm not sure how much I could actually talk on. It's just good. I appreciate Karina bringing it up, but I'm not sure how much I can talk on the experience of it. But I did think it was a little awkward that there was repeated suggestions that maybe they were not, healthy enough or whatever, when the survival of people who've been through slavery and all of that that history, like there's got to be a ton of resilience. And so I wish there was a little bit more digging into the fact that they were the first to die and the first to be eaten, rather than just speculating, they weren't fit as fit as the others or whatever. That's as far as I'd say with that. And I think when it comes to some of the other questions it brings up of, the Wampanoag people, or just whenever native names were mentioned, it wasn't in any kind of orthography. It was clearly some kind of anglicized version of, whatever that name might have been. And Wampanoag and their role and their history and ownership and sovereignty, and that there are still Wampanoag people who speak up and speak for themselves to this day, as much, that has gone on in that area for however many hundreds of years. And so that's pretty much all I think I'd have to say. But it's good to, that is brought up.
In terms of the whaling research I was doing, and he mentions it in the book, that the ships were very diverse. So there was the more the whaling fleet reached out into the South Pacific, the more diverse the whaling fleets became. And he brings up some of that. So there's the diversity of the ships is there a little bit. There's things that are kind of missed. William Bond, like, he's the hero of the book, where he goes dives down into the ship as it's sinking, and brings up the compasses and stuff like that. That's going to, that's what saved them. So there's places where it was missed in terms of just the blatant racism that was happening. But the history of whaling is interesting. There was I think this would make an awesome book and movie. There was an all-black whaling ship, that was one of the things I uncovered when I was researching. I thought that's really interesting. And then the diversity of, like you said, well, there weren't women working on the whaling crews, but later in the commercial, because they were leaving for so long, they had to leave for so much longer because they'd wiped out so many more of the whales to go from Nantucket to New Bedford up to the Arctic. They started taking their wives and families. Wow. So later, another crazy Alaskan thing was in 1871, the whaling fleet got stuck in the ice. The ice moved in quicker, and 33 ships were crushed in the ice of Alaska. And that was 1,000 people were on those 33 boats, and they all survived. And it was women and children too. Wow. Yeah. And there was one guy that stayed. So that's part of the story that I'm working on.
Wow.
Yeah. He only survived because of the Inupiaq people. Yeah.
I wanted to add one little tidbit. I went to Gamble on St. Lawrence Island and hung out with one of their elders, Anders Apassinguk. And we went into his house, and on his wall was a spear, a metal spear. Oh. And he said, "This is a metal spear from the 1800s from the New England whalers that was just lodged and stuck in one of the whales for however long until Anders and his crew got that whale.
And what's so cool
You know?
about those is that they were stamped on them, and they know the ship. So that's how they started to know the ship, that the whales were that old, because they could trace them back to the actual ship. Which brought me to another element of race that doesn't cover in the book, is that the man that invented that harpoon was black.
Wow.
His name was Lewis Temple, and so he invented that in the 1800s. Wow. And that's the harpoon that really like did in the whale. So that was a toggling harpoon, but he took that technology from the Inupiaq, the toggling harpoon tip was an Alaskan invention, essentially. And when they took that and employed that into the commercial whaling, it was the whales were done for, because then they couldn't get away. Because that's the toggling harpoon tip's the tip that'll go in and turn sideways, and then it's through the skin and it's hooked and it'll hold. Before that, they would lose massive numbers of whales. They would injure them and they would just swim off and die.
Wow.
Thank you. Claire, I see you are ready with this microphone. So, audience, this is your turn now. We have someone here.
Yeah. Do you think that Philbrook is writing this from his point of view? Yeah. Or is he just poking the bear a little bit to get people to think about these things? Because it seems like it's such an upside down view of nature that generally is taught in colleges and high schools now, right? Except for, I guess, the guy that's in the presidency seems to have a whole nother world he lives in. But I think most people don't really buy into this idea of animals being, primitive monsters with no feelings, that aren't worthy of consideration, that have no emotions. But so, do you think he did it on purpose, or does he really believe it?
Well, I just wonder if when it comes to what is the resource, what's used as the resource. Like right now, I think we have a much different relationship with whales probably than they had when that was providing so much oil for the people, And so I think that was the mindset then. I just wonder if that would continue to be a mindset if we just kept having to use whales for most of our oil like that. But just that's such a weird thing, like that provides so much oil, for the people, But I think, yeah, I agree. There's more nuance in people, but I think fundamental, like relationship wise, like that's it. Using, that's still like the harsh sea. We still talk about it like that, and I think in many other cultures would be the sea is giving. The Arctic is giving. Or like how the Arctic refuge is talking about it was just some blank space that it's just nothing. It's just ice. That's still talked about like that, when in reality it's a giving, immensely complex kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know if I would never surmise to know what he was thinking, but he's staying with those two main sources. I mean, he's got a ton of sources. Half the book at the end is that, but I think it would have been interesting to see him shift and maybe tell a little bit more of the science now, that they were. I think that they're pretty smart creatures. Yeah,
As if.
yeah.
I think
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that to me indicates.
You got to keep the mic.
I mean, that indicates his feeling about man's relationship to animals.
Well, no, I think those as ifs were. I don't know if he was quoting from Owen or yeah.
I guess that's what I should have started out
Yeah,
asking.
but I think he might have had a couple of his own as ifs in there. There was a whole string of them.
Oh, before we take the next question, the museum asked me to encourage people to go get their stuff. If you left anything in the museum, they're closing the doors at 7. How about parking? Parking will be open until the event is over.
So my question stems from the theme of a survival story and some of the elements that were brought up as the Western frontier. And to me, it's an interesting question as technology goes on and on. What is the frontier? You know, is a boat really as remote as it, as it was 100 years ago? So how's that going to change the sense of frontier and survival?
Good question. I think the frontier has always been a construct, and I think it just fascinates me. I think it's what I was trying to parse out, or is how that frontier, that concept, that myth of always going to something, whether it's that whale or that oil or the West, and getting land and taming land, that kind of thing. That myth, of how in order to do that, you need to dehumanize yourself and be ready to kill, and that's largely what those stories are about. Be ready to kill, either other animals or other people, So
I would think too, we have that on the horizon, just in terms of, like the next frontier might be climate change and figuring out how to survive in this world that we've created that is now going to cause problems. And I think the answers will come from indigenous people, like trying to learn again how to live with the land instead of against it. And it'll be a new kind of survival until we know how to do that. I think the survival from an indigenous perspective is it's just life. It's not a brutal. It wasn't a brutal fighting against the land thing. You already said that. It was just like the ocean is there, and you know what the resources are, and you know how to be a part of that. And I think that's a big difference. And I think the coming survival story is going to be, that's why part of our fascination with the apocalypse, the post-apocalyptic stuff. It's what's coming. How do we live without the resources that we have, if we use them all, which we seem like we want to? Well,
I don't know if any of you have seen the movie that aired earlier from 1915, which is relatively recent history. And I was amazed at how close the native hunters went right up to the ice floes that the walruses were on. I mean, they're right next to those walruses when they throw their harpoons in them. And the walruses are making no effort to leave. Now, Ishmael, this to me very much ties in. I didn't pick this up from the movie, but how behavior and mentality changed in this brief time period, perhaps for the animals too, and very related to climate change and the effect that it has on the animals. I don't see that our behavior as a society has gone that much toward respect for the animals. How I find people very reluctant to think about respecting the animals that we eat every day as conscious entities. And so, Ishmael, I'd really especially like to hear what you have to say that relates, if that makes any sense, to relate to those concepts.
Sure, I think we could talk for hours about this. I'd totally love to check in after. But I think in the stories, embedded in the stories, are narratives and images that tune a person's mind into a symbiotic, reciprocal relationship with the rest of the world, just relationships. And one of the essential relationships we have is what we eat. And it's natural law of eat and be eaten, and humans just deathly afraid of being eaten, but you go into the oral literature, the old stories, especially when they're told in the language, you get a much deeper sense of that symbiotic connection, and then when you look at actually how the streams and the coasts and the forests and everything were managed, it was really consciously managed. It wasn't just this sort of simple, pristine life. It was very sophisticated, and how streams were just properly, rocks were placed in a certain way, or there was you could go to Professor Steve Langdon's writings. He's professor in Anchorage, and good friend of my family's who studied salmon, and you get a sense that the population of the people and of the salmon are totally interdependent. So sometimes if the one population goes up, the other's going to go down. In terms of the Tlingit relationship to the people, it's a symbiotic relationship, and that's why I think there's more going on than we think when it comes to this. When we harvest animals, that sense of respect, and whatever is done, even thoughts somehow, like the elders say, thoughts somehow affect that relationship. Yep.
Do you have another question back there?
In a book I was just looking at, just happened to find, it was called "If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories?" And it goes into how trying to figure out if the indigenous people's stories, can they be true and untrue, and can the scientific sort of background stories that we tell to contradict the native stories, can they both be true and untrue at the same time? Do you have any feeling kind of on that?
Well, I think Native people themselves have a hard science. It may be different in many ways. It's more experiential, but but experiential knowledge is real knowledge. Real, valid, hard science type knowledge that consistently has been, overlooked. But I think there's, and when we go to the oral literature side of it, to me it's a fine understanding of human psychology, because we really do think in narrative and image, and in the Western science literate world, we try to force ourselves into thinking a way that's not actually tuned into how our psyche actually works, And so I think actual scientists, not people who have been, brainwashed or people who, are just too culturally biased, to not, pay attention to other people's, but actual scientists will really see all the crossover with indigenous knowledge, because there's many aspects of it that's hard science, and then the rest of it too has something to say to science in terms of what's really understanding these relationships that we're talking about right now.
I have an anecdotal story of kind of uncovering or discovering a little what you're saying. When Nelson came, the explorer who's coming from, working with the Smithsonian, Nelson Island in Southwest Alaska is named after him. When he came in the late 1800s to Southwest Alaska, the Yupik people had stories of a creature called Batlqayq, and it's like this big, long, very alligator-like creature that they had painted on the sides of their kayaks and in their wooden bowls. And they had an explanation about how this creature would come up out of the water and grab people on the banks of grassy banks and stuff like that. And he said that they said the creature lived there in warmer times, and he dismissed it. He dismissed them as, like that. He assumed that it's either a fictional creature or they came across the land bridge and it was some remnant of the Asiatic crocodile in their mythology. And so I grew up with this monster kind of as a background story, that he was in the lakes, and the last one was killed. And so I was fascinated with this creature, thinking, like, where's it come from? Like, where's the science behind it, I guess? Because I knew it had to have been there at some point. And I was talking with my friend Grant Fairbanks there before this event, and we were looking at the skulls from the Pleistocene in there, right? Well, I was in the Toronto Museum, and they had the same display of skulls, and at the end was the biggest skull, and we're looking only at what's on land. But during the Pleistocene, the megafauna, the big creatures, right? Well, what was in the water? And it was a creature that looked like, it was very much crocodile or alligator-like, with a skull like the size of this table. And so those were here too, in warmer times when the people from Alaska were here, that have been here. So yeah, I think it's that there's those stories, there's truth to them, and we have to respect the truth that's there.
Because, I think this could be a very long discussion. I'm trying not to be confused.
It's going to go
I don't want to be but that we think in images and narrative. And when we're raised with these old stories, whether we take them literally or not, which many of them actually do, but whether we take them literally or not, there's something it does to our psyche that tunes us into a ecological consciousness. And that's scientific. To be, have a sophisticated, discerning way in your relationships with the world.
By all means, let's continue the conversation outside. We are out of time at this point. I'd like to thank you for your insights and your questions. We really appreciate your diving into the discussion, and we encourage you to pick up a copy of Nathaniel Philbrick's book. Our speakers will be available out in the atrium to keep talking, and they have their books available out there as well. Additionally, if you'd like further information about the Big Read programming, talk to Kate. Yeah. And if you'd like more information about 49 Writers or want to learn how to become a member, talk to Jeremy. And either way, thank you so much for being here tonight. We'll see you out there.
Thank you.